Well, good morning. Welcome to this American Enterprise Institute event. Is sector-based training the answer to America's skills challenge? My name is Brent, Orrell, and I'm a senior fellow here in domestic policy studies, where I focus my research on workforce development and job training. For those of you new to AEI, we are a nonpartisan think tank committed to making the intellectual, moral, and practical case for expanding freedom, increasing opportunity, and strengthening the free enterprise system in America and around the world. Today's event is focused on a paper developed under the auspices of AEI's Workforce Futures Initiative. The WFI is an ongoing collaboration between AEI, the Brookings Institution, and the Harvard Kennedy School's Project on the Workforce. The purpose of WFI is to explore what the evidence tells us about the effectiveness of America's workforce development strategies and programs. When WFI was launched, our hope was to develop a set of quote-unquote playbooks to be used by policymakers and practitioners to focus attention and resources on workforce practices that work. This turned out to be a significant challenge, as the evidence for what works in workforce development remains remarkably thin. Our workforce system is one of the most modestly funded in the developed world. Perhaps, as one of our steering committee members, Harry Holzer, said, we're stuck in a low-resource, low-benefit equilibrium that makes it difficult for elected officials to justify increasing investments, without which it will be extremely difficult to improve outcomes. It's catch-22. And that is a very good question. Amidst this generally uninspiring backdrop, a few workforce practices did demonstrate significant positive returns, and we're here today to talk about the preeminent example of successful workforce programs, sector-based employment and training. I won't give away the punchline except to say that these programs have delivered remarkably strong results in terms of employment and wage outcomes. Our panel this morning is here to unpack the evidence around sector-based employment and training and give us insight into how it works, why it's successful, and what its limitations might be. I'm joined by three senior experts in the field of sector-based training research and practice. Rick Hendra, who directs the Center for Data Insights at MDRC, who uses rigorous data science methods to improve programs that serve populations in need. During his tenure at MDRC, Rick has led quantitative research on a range of projects focused on upward mobility, including the most comprehensive review of impact data from leading sector-based training programs. Garrett Warfield is Senior Director of Research and Evaluation for Year Up, one of the nation's most successful and highly regarded sector-based training programs, where he oversees all work designed to improve and test the impact of the program. Garrett and his team manage Year Up's national survey and reporting system, direct 3 federally sponsored randomized control trials, and manage rapid cycle evaluation and data science projects in partnership with leading research firms and universities across the country. And finally, Kadeem Nooreh is a postdoctoral fellow at the National Bureau of Economic Research, a research associate at Opportunity Insights at Harvard University, and a research advisor for RISE at Schmidt Futures. Kadeem earned his PhD in public policy from Harvard University in 2023. Congratulations, Kadeem. An MS in Applied Economics from Montana State University in 2017, and a BS in Mathematics, Economics, and Physics at Hillsdale College in 2015. Some of his recent research is focused on the differing benefits of sector-based programs for different categories of trainees. Our agenda today will be as follows. Each of our panelists will provide a short overview of what sector-based training looks like from the standpoint of their individual research perspectives. This will be followed by a conversation about some of the key unanswered questions relating to sector-based programs. And finally, we'll be opening the floor to questions from our in-person audience as well as those who are joining us online. If you are watching via the webcast and want to ask a question, you can do so by emailing Josh Boynton at josh.boynton, B-O-Y-N-T-O-N, @aei.org, or on the platform formerly known as Twitter at hashtag AEI sector-based. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Rick to give us the big picture. What is sector-based employment and training, and how does it work?
Great, thanks, Brent. I'm really pleased to be here today. So I'll, as Brent said, talk about the evidence and the open questions just to sort of set the table. Okay, so to understand sector programs, it's very important to understand what happened before them. So before sector programs, we had about 2 decades of sort of mixed to kind of disappointing findings of job training. So job training programs would typically help people to get jobs that they probably would have gotten anyway, but they got them a little bit more quickly. So there's some exceptions to that, but overall, the weight of the evidence of sort of the 1980s, 1990s training programs was of programs that just accelerated job finding, didn't really lead to upward mobility, didn't really lead to long-term advancement. If they had impacts, these programs typically had impacts only for a couple of years and they faded away. So sector programs are breaking this pattern. And I'll talk about some of the evidence and sort of how it's built up over time. But before I get into that, I want to talk about what these programs are. So when we talk about the elements of sector programs, we're talking about programs that are focused on a very specific industry or cluster of occupations, very much tailored and customized to local demand conditions. These are programs that have what we call a dual customer orientation. So they're focused very much on participants and helping job seekers get ready for the labor market, but just as much a audience for these programs is employers who are ultimately going to hire these job seekers. And the employer engagement is not just setting things up in the beginning, it's ongoing and it's deep. So employers are involved in every facet of the program in a true sector program. They focus on high wage sectors. So this isn't work first. This isn't just get any job. This is get a job in a promising sector with room for advancement. And the jobs are supposed to be stretch jobs. These are not supposed to be jobs that you could just walk into without the program. These are jobs that are within reach after you have the training services and the other wraparound services that sector programs provide. So in terms of the trajectory of the evidence, we had, like I said, a couple of decades of rather disappointing findings. Sector programs sprung up in the 1980s, but it wasn't until 2007 that we had rigorous evidence from the sectoral employment impact study that public-private ventures did. This was a very exciting study for those of us in the field who have gotten used to sort of really, short-term impacts that went away or impacts that were only due to finding jobs more quickly. Suddenly we had now wage increases. We had large earnings effects. And honestly, these effects were so large that some of us were a little skeptical at first about whether this was real. We just hadn't seen impacts like this before. So shortly after the findings came out from the PPV study, MDRC and our collaborators did the work advance study, which replicated these findings and found, indeed, we have a model here that has an existence proof that it can increase wage rates, it can increase earnings and advancement. That led to sort of a flurry of testing in the 2010s. We had the really amazing impacts from Europe, Project Quest, others. And these were all rigorous random assignment studies. So there was just irrefutable evidence that this model could work. And then we started to see some federal action, starting with WIOA, which started to include sectoral elements all the way right now through the CHIPS Act. So in terms of the various components of these models, they vary quite a bit, but I think there's 6 core components. The first is screening. These programs are known to do fairly aggressive screening. The ratio of those who apply to enroll is somewhere around 10%. So you might have 100 people apply for every 10 that get into a program. Now, I want to emphasize that's not all screening. A lot of that is participants also dropping out or deciding it's not for them, before they enter the program. But the screening is to make sure it's fit for a sector. For example, if you're going into healthcare and you're squeamish about blood, probably not a good fit, right? So So screening is an important element. Occupational skills training is a central element. This is short-term training, almost always a year or less, often around 6 months or so. The work readiness training that's provided, you could call this like soft skill training. It's sector infused. So what's the sort of the culture, the norms of the sector that you're entering? The wraparound supports, we're talking about things like transportation and childcare, referrals for uniforms, that sort of thing. Job placement and support is obviously central because that's the goal here, is to get a good job. And the post-employment support is, I would say, more uneven. We don't always see robust post-employment services after sector programs, but some programs feature that component. So in terms of the evidence, again, just to underline, these programs can work. And I want to talk about sort of the build here from the necessary to sufficient conditions. So clearly, in order for a sector program to achieve the goals, we have to have individuals complete training. And the programs are actually quite good compared to traditional training programs. We used to have a lot of dropout in training programs, perhaps because of the screening, perhaps because of the wraparound. Training completion rates are quite good in these programs, and they usually will promote training completion credential attainment. They'll often increase employment in the sector, which is great, but that's not really the end goal here. The hypothesis is that by getting a job in the right sector, that job will confer better wages or better working conditions. So it's really the sufficient condition is on the right. We sometimes, I would say we often see, but not always, see increases in short and long-term earnings. So one of the priorities for the field is to help sector programs work more consistently, but like Brent said, this is one of the strongest models we have out there with really impressive findings. So the findings from several major studies are shown in the slide. Dark orange shows positive and statistically significant impacts on earnings. And we showed the latest year that was available at the time that we made this slide. So what you see is lots of dark orange. So the Adams study, Europe had just really spectacular impacts out as far as year 7, and we'll see even longer term impacts coming out soon. Project Quest had impacts out through year 11. Again, against the backdrop of the older programs, which usually faded around 2 to 3 years, this is really kind of amazing to see impacts hold up. And you can imagine about the benefit cost returns of a program that's achieving impacts that far out. The sectoral employment impact studies shown here, all 3 programs had large impacts, and Work Advance, even out at year 7, Perscolis was still having robust effects. But you also see here some light orange, so some programs that did not achieve positive and statistically significant impacts, notably HPOG, which had a lot of programs, and also PACE. So no silver bullet, we're never gonna have a silver bullet, but we do wanna see how we can make the programs work more consistently. Still, very impressive effects overall. Possible reasons why some of the programs were not as effective. These are just hypotheses. We think sometimes it's choosing the wrong sector at the wrong time. It may have been a very strong sector, you set up a program, then the demand moved on. Targeting the wrong wage level, often aiming too low on wages, I would argue. The training might be too short in some cases. Having not enough employer connections can be really damaging with these programs. Having new providers provide the services who aren't as established with employers, or having providers provide these programs where workforce development is just one of many things that they do, so they're not really focused on the program. Those are some aspects that we see as possible reasons that some of the programs are not as effective. We have really encouraging subgroup findings. These programs have shown really positive effects for workers of color. Certainly not in every evaluation, but in a lot of evaluations we've seen the impacts are actually stronger. We think that this has to do with the fact that sector programs are very good at vouching for job seekers, they're very good at brokering, and they're very good at overcoming social network deficits where individuals might not have good access to a field, or they're good at helping fields that have a lot of occupational stereotypes like gendered sectors. For example, a lot of sector programs have helped females enter the construction trades. In terms of the provider types, we don't have airtight evidence on this. There is definitely a pattern where some of the largest impacts that we see are given by nonprofits who are very deeply rooted in their communities. They really know their participants well, they know their employers well. And the impacts seem to be somewhat weaker at larger institutions like community colleges. There are really important exceptions to that pattern, and I think we just need more evidence to be sure about that, but that does seem to be a bit of a pattern. So going forward, we think it's very important that sector programs not overdo it on sort of nano-focusing the training. We don't want them to train for just one skill for a particular employer. So this isn't like highly customized on-demand training. We want workers to have transferable skills so they could navigate the sector and have those human capital increases are going to help them move from job to job. We think the wraparound supports are critical. I mentioned screening as an issue in these programs. These programs are not reaching the most disadvantaged workers, and if we're going to do a better job at that, we're going to have the right wraparound supports. And I would argue that that should include stipends, like Europe includes, as an important feature. And being attuned to local labor markets is critical. I think the original PPV study had the great title of tuning into local labor markets. It is so easy to fall away from that and to revert to traditional job training. So it just requires a lot of focus to stay in touch with employers, on the ground, on the phone, so that you know, even before the labor market, the DOL data shows what's happening in a sector, you need to have a much more leading sense of what's going to happen with demand if you're going to stay on top of it. So strong employer relationships are something that, as we think about scaling sector programs, making sure that providers are going to be able to build those strong employer relationships. Those relationships require some credibility. So it can be hard to get your foot in the door. So that's something that we're going to have to think about as we scale these programs more broadly. I would argue we have to be more thoughtful about screening practices to make sure that we want to make sure that individuals have the likelihood to succeed in a program. I want to emphasize that with screening, we're not only talking about on the lower end, we're also talking about screening out individuals who don't need the program. There's a lot of individuals who would be just fine with job search programs, job matching programs. So it's finding that middle group that could really benefit from sector programs. And the wraparound services, I want to again hold up stipends is very important. We know a lot of people who apply to sector programs but don't actually enroll say that I didn't realize that I had to be full-time at this. How am I going to support myself while I'm in training? So the financial support, is a really important wraparound support to consider. And having an industry-recognized credential, acknowledging that there's a lot of work to be done to, sort of clarify credentials, et cetera, but we do think credentials matter. So just to sort of wrap up, we do have to focus on, screening is an element that we really are careful about. We don't want to limit who's eligible. We don't want this to only, you could think of a typical sector participant, and I'm really generalizing, but often it's the some college group. These are individuals who they may have started college and dropped out. They often will have a high school diploma, but it is a fairly narrow band. And there's a lot of people in that band, of course, but we want to expand it to the more disadvantaged. We want TANF recipients to be able to take advantage of these programs, SNAP, et cetera. Again, deep, real, ongoing employment connections are very important. And work that we did with Larry Katz and Jonathan Roth pointed to the identification. Like if there's one thing we're really sure about in terms of the evidence, we have a lot of work to do to figure out the active ingredients, but it's finding these high quality, attainable jobs. That picking the right job seems really important. And I'll just close with these open questions about what components drive, what are the active ingredients? We need better fidelity measures in this field. It's a little bit loose. I mean, you could say, having a dual customer perspective is important, but how do you measure that? When is that strong? When is that weak? So we need better fidelity measures and having more consistent performance. Seeing whether this can work in bigger institutions, I think, is a very open question because the approach is so tailored. Serving the more disadvantaged as a goal. And we don't know if remote training works. A lot of providers went to remote training during COVID. A lot of them kept hybrid models now. We don't know if the relationships that we think are so crucial are going to hold up in a remote format. So with the Google Career Certificate study that we're currently doing and some other studies in the field, we'll be finding out more about other modes of training. And how to scale is the question that we tackle in the paper that Brent talked about. Okay.
Why don't you hand the clicker down to Garrett so he can take us into what this actually looks like on the ground for an organization that is implementing, as I said, one of the best regarded sector-based employment and training programs in the country. So take us through, we've seen the research, it works. Tell us what your research says about how and why it works.
Absolutely. First, I'll say thank you, though, for hosting us. We research types don't get out often enough sometimes. There's a 50-50 chance that we'd get up here and talk about sectoral employment programs, and half that chance was you holding me up over the podium, fuzzy and dazed and confused like Punxsutawney Phil telling you 6 more weeks of winter, so we can go back home to the comforts of a data set. In any case, it's nice to see you all here. Thank you. At Year Up, we are a national sectoral social enterprise, as Rick was describing. We have 2 customer bases, our students who enroll in our programs and our employer partners that help us generate revenue to operate the program. But we work on both sides of this gap between trained talent who are looking for an opportunity and employers who are looking to fill roles they otherwise aren't filling. We are in about 36 locations across the country in a little over 20 cities. And we hit a meaningful milestone in this last year, reaching over 40,000 enrolled students in the program. That said, we've also seen some remarkable outcomes for our students. Now, $52,000 a year as an average starting salary is noteworthy. It's upwards of a 4-fold increase over pre-Year Up earnings for the majority of our participants. That said, that's not why I'm in the room. As both Brent and Rick have mentioned, we're here because Year Up has a significant evidence base. We've done a number of robust studies over the years, one of which is featured on the slide here, showing remarkable earnings gains sustained over time. Again, Rick had shared some of that data, but as well as that, a very thoughtful cost-benefit analysis that shows even for a program as robust as Year Up, and one that is, frankly, as costly as Year Up, there's still a very, very meaningful return on that investment for each dollar that goes into the program. Now, as important as those findings are, and we'll get into this a little bit later with colleague Kadim's work, there are some noteworthy variances in those impacts. First thing to know is every subgroup, no matter by race or gender or geography, experiences significant and large earnings gains. But there are some heterogeneities and some differences, so it becomes incredibly important that we fully appreciate and understand who Year Up is serving. Over 90% of our students are students of color. The vast majority of them come from low-income households. Many are connected to SNAP and TANF benefits that were mentioned earlier, or otherwise they're facing a variety of other financial barriers to employment. In addition to that, the majority of folks who come through Year Up have tried college before. About 60% plus have had some classes. Some have tried to enroll and have accumulated some student debt, and then left those pathways simply because it wasn't sustainable and needed an alternative way that would allow for some stability while learning along the way. The majority of our participants are not parents, so this is an important subgroup we'll need to attend to later. So it's 10% or fewer are parents, which is something else to keep in mind. That said, we only have 3 bright line criteria to get into Year Up. Your age is 18 to 29, you have a legal right to work in the United States, and you have a high school diploma or a GED. That's the base requirement to enter the program. The program operates conventionally over the course of a year, but even in our shorter duration models, the same theory of change holds. There's a period of classroom training that lasts up to 6 months, a sustained internship or work-based learning opportunity with an employer that follows that for up to 6 months, and then afterwards there is post-program placement support. Now, over 50% of those internships actually convert into full-time employment that's directly related to training, and that's arguably one of the most important drivers of the long-term impacts that we've seen through our evaluation studies. So, as Rick had mentioned, a key part of the program is ensuring that continuity and attachment to actual quality jobs. And to get folks through all this, there's a significant opportunity cost to students. So we need a variety of wraparound supports. We have teams of dedicated social workers who provide acute and ongoing support for students who face a variety of challenges. We also have a student contract. This is a point system that sets the expectations and norms for attitude, behavior, and communication in the program. And if a student doesn't achieve those expectations, they can lose points in that token economy, which eventually can lead them being counseled out of the program if they don't meet those expectations during the course of the program. And last but not least, their financial stipends during the full duration of the program. And importantly, we recently drastically increased the amount of this stipend from a couple $100s a week to over $500 a week during the internship phase. Such is the importance of that financial support to ensure completion of the program. This absolutely helps mitigate those opportunity costs to students who might otherwise be challenged to turn their full attention to a program rather than what income they might be able to put together through part-time work or jobs that may not be the highest quality, but nonetheless bring some earnings into their homes. Our job training program focuses on a number of sectors featured here, and every student also gets what Rick had alluded to earlier, some essential skills training that we would argue are valid across all the sectors we train in. Now, this year we're going to be serving upwards of 4,500 students that will pass through these training pathways, but we also realize that two things in the last couple of years. First, there are some students who are all too eager to get started at work and they need that financial support sooner. And secondly, some of the students we serve, they don't all need the same exact program experience. Some are ready for work sooner, and so we've pushed on the orthodoxy and have tried to speed up those on-ramps in some accelerated models that might be a few months shorter in some cases for students who are ready for that opportunity. In any and all of these cases, we're working very closely with our corporate partners. We've got over 200 of them. The majority of them are in the Fortune 500 to make sure that our training curricula is providing what those employers need on the job to ensure their and our students' success. Most folks know Year Up as a training program, and indeed we are, but we have a broader portfolio of work. In the center here, UPro Placement is a staffing agency that focuses on skills-first placements. It works with the tens of thousands Year Up alumni across the country, as well as alumni from other programs, community-based orgs, and sectoral programs. And Grads of Life is our branch that focuses on consultation services and skills-first hiring and advancement practices at companies. They go hand in hand with those companies to ensure that once they are hiring in folks, perhaps Year Up students, that they're doing everything they can to retain those talent over time at the companies. Now, we're here today in part because at Year Up, we know we have a lot of expertise to bear, but we also recognize that we as one program can't do it all. There are cousin and sibling programs across the country, some of whom Rick had mentioned, but certainly larger systems, community college systems and other community-based organizations that have access to an opportunity talent demographic. Year Up isn't going to get there without working in partnership with these other organizations and what we're calling coordinated talent networks or workforce ecosystems. In any case, part of why we're here is to better understand how our practices can relate in partnership to others, including community colleges, to get folks connected to quality employment in the form of like advanced career services, if you will. Now, on that note, I want to be mindful of time and also pass things over to my friend Kadeem to lead you through some of the latest analysis on some of Year Up's outcomes.
Awesome. Thank you so much for these opening comments. My talk is going to dive into some more detail for a particular program. I'm going to be presenting results from a study that looks at impact variation in sectoral job training, specifically looking at evidence from Year Up. This work is joint with my co-author, who's a PhD candidate at Harvard Economics. Her name's Namrata Narayan, and this work was supported by a grant from the ACF. So the thing that motivated this particular study was this overarching question. Can job training help the most disadvantaged? This is something that's been posed a couple of times already today. And so this is in the context of increasing earnings inequality and slow earnings growth for the poor over the past few decades. There's this question of, can job training be a bridge to opportunity for those that are stuck at the bottom of the income distribution? Historically, impacts on job training programs broadly have been underwhelming. There's a nice review of a lot of this literature by Card, Kluve, and Weber, published in 2018, where they do a meta-analysis of 200 different kinds of programs across different OECD countries and find small effects on employment and even smaller effects on earnings in the short to medium run from these programs. But as we've talked about today, more recently, sectoral job training programs seem to be more promising. And so recently, Katz et al. We say et al. When there's more than 3 authors, but Rick Hendra is actually one of the authors in this paper, so that's I should give that credit. But more recently, these results on sectoral job training programs have been summarized, and earnings impacts upwards of 53% increases in earnings. That's specifically from Europe, a few years out from the program. But little is known, or I think surprisingly little is known about who exactly these programs work for or why. And that's why I came in to do this study, and this is going to explore both of those questions. So the first question I'm going to explore in this is there systematic variation in impacts from these programs, specifically Europe, on earnings? And if so, what might explain this variation? And I want to highlight that this is going to determine whether or not these programs can, in fact, help the most disadvantaged. If it's the case that people who are maybe in historically disadvantaged groups get less out of these programs than the typical participants, then that's actually going to potentially temper the extent to which these can be solutions or sort of a panacea to bridge the opportunity gap from the most disadvantaged. And so to get into this project in particular, so the setting, I'm going to leverage an RCT that was conducted on Year Up. I'll get into the details of that in a second, but I'm going to explore impact variation and then explanations for that variation. I'm going to exploit 2 features of the RCT that make it particularly useful for this. So first, there's a relatively large sample size, and there's also a large 3-year earnings impact. And so that gives me power to actually explore heterogeneity in some level of detail. And then on top of that, there were surveys conducted on various kinds of soft skills at both baseline and then shortly after the program, which allows me to assess whether or not growth in these kinds of skills actually seems to be important as a mechanism for the longer term earnings impacts. And so what do we actually do in the paper? And I'm going to also preview the findings. We're going to use a methodology. We're going to use machine learning, a methodology called causal force to estimate 3-year earnings impact variation. What that's going to do is it's going to allow me to search over a series of different characteristics of the people that go in the program and find groups that tend to have low versus high impacts on earnings. And the key finding that I'm going to find from this, the first one, is that there's going to be large impact heterogeneity, by which I mean people in the top 5th of the impact distribution are going to get 3 times the earnings boost roughly than people at the bottom 5th of the earnings impact distribution. And then perhaps more importantly, those in the lowest impact group are disproportionately Black, female, and poor, which highlights this question of maybe those who are the most disadvantaged, maybe they don't get as much return from these programs or this program in particular. And then I'm going to explore the link between impacts on various mediators and impacts on earnings in order to see what might explain this variation. And there the key finding is going to be that the earnings impacts actually seem to be explained by whether or not people get moved into a Europe target sector, not necessarily growth in measured skills. And so I want to say measured skills there. I want to highlight that. I don't necessarily think we're measuring all of the skills that this program confers, and I'll talk about that more, and hopefully we can get into that in discussion. And so just to get into a little bit of the actual data I'm using, it comes from this Europe RCT that was conducted in 2013 through 2014 by Apt Associates. It was part of a series of other impact evaluations called PACE, which were mentioned earlier. And just to break down the data in some detail, over 2,500 participants in this randomized control trial. The sites were in a variety of major US cities listed here. And the actual data I'm going to be using is going to come from 3 surveys. And so there was a survey done at baseline where I'm going to have a variety of demographic characteristics, labor market outcomes for people, as well as measures of their human capital. There was a 1-year survey. It was actually done more like 6 to 7 quarters post-random assignment. I just say 1 year for ease of communication, where I'm going to get measures of post-program character skills, some measures of career-related soft skills and job placement. And then at the 3-year mark, I'm going to have a measure of quarterly earnings. And very quickly, since I'm using survey data, you might worry that maybe the reported earnings aren't necessarily accurate. And so as a bit of a check first, we show that demographically, the people in the treatment and control group responding to the surveys are statistically the same along a variety of characteristics. And then also the average impacts measured on earnings match those that were estimated on administrative records in other settings. And so it seems these survey data are actually pretty high quality. Okay, so next I'm going to describe exactly how I use machine learning to estimate treatment effect heterogeneity. I'm not going to go into it in too much detail for time, but just to give you guys a little bit of a sense of what I'm going to do here. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to break the sample from the RCT into 2 separate samples. One is going to be the forest sample where I'm actually going to estimate heterogeneity. And then there's going to be a holdout sample where I can test whether or not the predictions actually work that I get from the forest sample. In order to estimate variation, this is too small to see. I'm not going to go into the actual procedure too much. You can think of it as a black box for now. But effectively what this procedure is going to do is it's going to split the data in various ways and see whether or not there are certain consistent groups, like say, black people with high grades and low income would be an example of a group, and see whether or not they consistently get low or high earnings relative to other groups. And so it's going to allow you to search over a series of variables to actually see what's explaining this impact heterogeneity, what's systematically related to actual impacts from the program. The output's going to be a function that's going to predict impacts for each individual based on a series of their baseline characteristics. And I'm going to have this holdout sample where I can validate the actual predictions. It passes sort of this validation test, and so then I'm going to apply and get predictions for everybody throughout the entire sample based on their individual levels of baseline covariates. Apologies for that long, convoluted explanation. I'm going to get to some results right now, I promise. So the first thing that we see from this is wide variation in impacts. So what I've plotted here on the x-axis, I've ranked every single individual who participated in the RCT, and on the y-axis, I have their predicted 3-year earnings impact. This is quarterly earnings. And so what you see is variation from roughly impacts of $1,000 to $3,000 in quarterly impacts from the program. One thing I should point out here is, and this is, as Garrett said, everyone gets a benefit from this program. $1,000 increase in quarterly earnings is actually quite a large impact, especially relative to other job training programs historically. But the variation, I think, is important to understand. The next thing that you can do is you can actually break these predictions into quintiles. And so there's going to be a table I'm going to show here, but I want to get you guys to understand how the different columns, what they're going to mean. There are 6 columns here. The first column, that's going to be the first quintile, and I'm going to show the percentage of that particular group that has a particular characteristic, and then I'm going to do that for each of the other quintiles and then show the difference. So if, as an example, let's take whether or not someone's race was black. What you can see is in the bottom quintile, so Q1 or the first column, 75% of the people are black. Whereas in the top quintile, those who get the largest earnings impacts, 31% are black. And so the difference there's underrepresentation of Black people in the top quintile relative to the bottom quintile by roughly 44 percentage points, is a way to think about this. And so then you can do it for a series of other characteristics. And so you see actually an increase in this category called another race. That's primarily Asian folks. And so there seems to be some sort of a substitution there between Black folks and those in this another race category. There's underrepresentation of women in the top quintile. There's major underrepresentation of those in the bottom income category at baseline. And then actually those with lower skills as measured at baseline seem to get larger effects than those with higher skills. And so that's actually a little bit of a surprising result. I can get into some discussion about what that might mean moving forward. But I think the key thing I wanted to point out here is that some of these demographic characteristics that we think of as indicating that you're in a historically disadvantaged group, those people seem to stack up at the bottom of the impact distribution. And so the final exercise that we do in this paper is we try and understand what explains this variation. And there are a few explanations. This is not an exhaustive list. It could be a growth in character skills, a growth in what I'm calling career skills, and placement into good jobs. Career skill has quotes around it because it's really more like career relevant soft skills, whether or not you know what kind of a job would be a good fit for you, not technical skills, which I think is the biggest thing that's missing from this, is that I don't have a high quality measure of technical skills to sort of see if that explains the variation. And so in order to look at these different categories, these different explanations, what we do is we create measures that correspond to each explanation. So we create an index of character skills, we create an index of career skills, and then we have an indicator of whether or not you're in a good job, which we're saying whether or not you're employed in a year-up target sector. So IT would be an example of one of the major target sectors from the program. And then we actually use machine learning again to find subgroups who vary on impacts on each of these measures. And then we leverage this to try and see, do impacts on skills or impacts in job quality correspond to earnings impacts? So if you have a larger effect on skill growth, for example, does that mean that you're going to have a larger effect on downstream earnings growth? And so one thing to note about this is that there is a time component to this. We're measuring the mediators here in the year 1 survey, but the earnings measures are not done until year 3. And so there's some time for these earnings impacts to actually evolve and be affected by the impacts on these mediators. Okay, so I'm going to present some results from this, but first I want to sort of describe how these things are going to be presented on a figure. I'm going to show on the y-axis the treatment effect on 3-year earnings by the quintile of the predicted mediator impact in question. So here it's character skill. If you're going to get a 1 there on the x-axis, that means you're at the bottom quintile of impacts on the character skill index that I discussed earlier. And if you get a 5, you're at the top of that impact distribution. And so I want to see the relationship. What you'd expect is a positive relationship between earnings and the level of the predicted impact for the mediator on this figure. But what you see here is that there's basically a flat relationship. What this means is if you're in a group that has a larger impact on your character skills as measured by survey data here, it doesn't seem like you're having any larger effect on your downstream earnings. The same thing is true using the career skill measures that we have access to, but you see a very different story when you actually look at target sector impact. And so what you see here is a very strong relationship. If you're in a group that gets a large effect on whether or not you move into a target sector, you get a large effect on your earnings. And so I think that I think Rick mentioned that one of the key things that seems to really matter is choosing the right sectors and making sure that people are actually able to get into these high-quality jobs that I would say is shown. This is evidence of that hypothesis here. Okay, so to conclude, revealed wide variation in earnings impacts from Europe. Though Europe is helping a negatively selected group overall, those in historically disadvantaged groups within this population are overrepresented at the bottom of the impact distribution. And this applies a kind of equity effectiveness trade-off, to use the language of economics, that's faced by the program. You can put some numbers to this. So there's an implied 18% increase in the benefit cost ratio from the program if they were to admit people on the basis of these predictions. But that would reduce the representation of female, Black, and poor individuals in the program by 7% to 13%, depending on which characteristic you're talking about. The variation seems to be best explained by whether or not the program shifts you into a target job sector, not necessarily skill growth, with the caveat that we're not necessarily measuring technical skills. One question that I have that I would love to get into in the discussion is, what role does program dropout play here? And I have some results on this. Maybe we can talk about it in the discussion. A couple of other relevant things, didn't get a chance to talk about. The paper is like 100 pages long at this point. But in this paper, we also revised the benefit cost ratio, accounting for the fact that there's actually some benefit to employers, and we also bring in the longer run effects in the literature. The estimate in the literature, we find that the benefit cost ratio is about 6 times larger than what's out there in the literature. I can get into the more details of that if we want to in discussion. And the last thing in work related to this, we're also finding that Europe earnings impact estimates can be replicated with a simple matching strategy, as in if you don't use the experiment, but instead you match individuals on basic demographics into the census, and you create a synthetic control group, you can basically replicate the effects of the experiment here, which I think speaks a little bit to potentially the screening question. You'd expect these would be very different people screened in that if they go through Europe's screening process. I think there are a host of other questions there, but I just wanted to put that out there for potential discussion. And that's it for me.
Wow. So I read something yesterday that journalism, there's a quote like, journalism is the willingness to have all of your preconceptions destroyed. Your willingness to hold up your ideas, the ideas that you start with and say, and be willing to accept the fact that they haven't been validated by what your investigation shows. And so there's a lot in this that takes a swing at some pretty core beliefs about what leads to career success. And so that's where I kind of want to start this conversation is particularly on this question of, well, it's implied in several different areas of your results, Kadeem, but it's always been one of my most cherished beliefs that it is the combination of technical training and non-technical skill, the non-cognitive soft skill combination that is the key to success in careers. Because those are key to sort of executing on task when you're in your job. They're also the key to learning. Those are key. The non-cognitive skills are keys to learning new skills. And what I'm getting out of this, you can correct me if I'm wrong, is that almost nothing matters other than what job you get placed into and whether it's a growth sector. Is that right?
Yeah, so I don't want to oversell anything or make too strong of conclusions. So I think it's that is an interpretation of our results, but I think it's important to realize that a lot of these things that you think of when you think about non-cognitive soft skills training, professionalism, these aren't necessarily the things that are being picked up in the measures that I have. So the measures include things like grit, confidence, like commitment, those sorts of things. And you might imagine that the key sort of soft skills that you get from this have more to do with like understanding different norms in the workplace or building good professional habits or something like this. And it's not clear to me that the measures that I have are necessarily picking up on those things. And so that's another caveat that I want to make. And I know that that's a big part of what Europe does in their training. But yeah, there seems to be something special about being able to get your foot in the door into one of these high-paying jobs that maybe you wouldn't have access to before, and so that I think is very sort of strongly borne out in the work.
So Garrett, can you just give your perspective on this question that we're discussing? I mean, how do you think about this combination of technical and non-technical skill development as success factors for participants in Europe?
It's a great question. I'll start by saying first, Kadeem gave fair credit to the quality of the skill measures from the RCT, and they are limited. There are many other things to take into consideration that we think are valuable to somebody's development. You named a couple of them, like how you show up and manage up to your manager. How do you lead a team meeting? Being present in and day out in the workplace, despite life challenges that might be getting in the way. That managing that navigation of getting to work is absolutely critical, and it's a fundamental part of what we teach in the program, and that's not necessarily captured in those measures. I'd say the biggest place where this comes into play for Europe is in our lead-up part of the program in the classroom training. We're underscoring the skills that I just described to make sure that once someone is in an internship and the door is cracked open, they can stay there and navigate that world incredibly well. That said, if all of the components were a Jenga tower and you were to pull one piece away that I would never want you to touch, it's that virtually guaranteed positive outcome that comes from having a work-based learning experience that converts into a full-time job afterwards. You can't be successful in that internship without the skills that you've mentioned. But even if you had those skills in spades, if the door weren't opened, it wouldn't matter. And I think it's for these reasons with some of the latest reports that have come out of some of our friends at Burning Glass Institute and Harvard that have shown the underemployment of folks with AAs and bachelor's degrees as well, even if you're coming out of school where you might have accumulated some social and technical skills to ready you for the workplace, if you don't have that connectivity to employment, those skills won't matter in your ultimate success and long-term success. And across these randomized control trials, the strongest predictor of long-term impacts we've demonstrated time and again is the quality job placement, and that is entirely facilitated by that internship that is the open door to it.
And I will, from a personal perspective, I'll testify to this because I worked at a company in which we were engaged with Europe in hosting a program participant. And the relentlessness with which the Europe team pursued keeping the door open, right? It's not just opening the door, but keeping it open and really saying, what are you saying to the employer, what are you doing to keep this person? You know, that was, it's not, in a sense, it's not enough to have a skilled and socially adapted worker. You've got to also have the support behind them to say, that's kind of pestering the employer a little bit. And it does feel like pestering. It's like, give me a break here. I've got other things I'm working on. It's not the only thing I have to do. The role of the organization in not just opening the door, but keeping it open, I think is significant as well. Rick, I wanted to give you a chance to get in on this as well, because I remember a meeting I was in. One of our co-authors who isn't with us here today, Kelsey Shaberg from MDRC, it was another meeting on an entirely different subject, and I was making this point about, the importance of soft skills, and you have to have these integrated. And she never said anything to me, but I saw her at the end of the table shaking her head. And don't go too. What I took from that is don't go too far down this pathway of, it's all about the soft skills. It's all about the professional skills. And I noted that in your wrap-up slide, those skills are not identified as being key success factors. Can you talk a little bit about it?
Yeah, I mean, first I'll just say that this research that academia is doing is so important because we have to find the minimum viable model. Like if workforce funding is going to stay at this low level that it's at right now, and if we're going to scale this, we have to figure out what minimally do we have to, what's the portable version of this model that we could take out into different systems. So it's so crucial to have this lens of, is it the soft skills, is it that job placement, et cetera. Yeah, and I would say that we do often think of soft skills as an important factor, but we have to look at the evidence. And here, with all caveats definitely taken into account, it appears that it's certainly not just the soft skills. I mean, we think that the hard technical skills are important. We're also not talking too much about the role of the provider. The provider plays a very important role because they're brokering, they have a lot of currency with these employers, and if the provider is vouching for a candidate, that goes a very long way in terms of the sort of theory of change, a harder thing to measure, but I would say this is really, this research design, first of all, is fantastic and gives us a way of sort of decomposing and getting to that minimum viable model. And I would say definitely, I'm not shocked to see that soft skills are sort of lower down the list. And we have to continue to study that because we don't need 6 components is a lot of components for a program to take on. So this is a very complex, very costly model. So we have to reduce it to what's essential.
Okay, so I'm sort of torn about how to proceed here. But let's deal with the question of the degree to which the success of the program depends upon its initial upfront screening. And I know that this is a matter of dispute, so I'm hoping you can have a really good argument here about the question of whether sector-based programs, including Europe, but not just Europe, whether their screening criteria are so strong that accounts for the level of success in terms of the outcomes and wages and employment. So whoever wants to jump into that one first, feel free.
So I happen to have a bonus slide that I think will help.
I promise I did not know that this bonus slide exists.
I just wanted to, I don't necessarily know if I have a strong conclusion, but I think some data might help us, help the discussion. So what this figure shows is it shows the earnings trajectory using W-2 earnings for the Europe RCT control group, the RCT I just talked about. And it shows a trajectory for a census comparison group. And that census comparison group is made by finding matches for each individual in the census, people who match on race, gender, year of birth, and the census tract that they grew up in. And so presumably what you would think if Europe was screening people in such a way that they were just getting these people who had higher potential in some facet, you might think that would show up in having different earnings trajectories. But if you look at this figure, they have very similar earnings trajectories throughout over several years. And so this was something that was actually a bit of a surprise for the research team. We kind of expected to see that orange curve just sort of be sort of level shifted up, showing that their screening process was finding these people that were talented in other kinds of ways. So I just wanted to start with that. I don't think you necessarily. It's possible that people who are screened by Europe, if they go back out on the market without the training, they have all these abilities that they just can't sort of bring to bear because they can't get their foot into a job. And so that could also is consistent with this sort of a pattern. But I think it's at least interesting.
I think a couple of things come to mind on this particular topic. First, across multiple randomized control trials, if we take the definition of impact as someone who goes through Europe has meaningfully improved earnings and outcomes over time than what they otherwise would have experienced, as represented by the control group, the long-term findings of the control group outside of the graph that Kadeem has here, but if you look to the actual source literature, shows that their income grows over time, but it's much more modest than Europe earnings over time. There remains a wide delta and differential, which is one argument towards, well, left to their own devices, these folks aren't jumping up tons of earnings over the years beyond the point of randomization, which is something to keep in mind. I think another important thing to keep in mind here is our demographic of who we serve. The quintiles you presented earlier with the heterogeneities and impact, the bottom quintile are folks who don't complete the Europe program. By vast majority, those are folks who don't make it through the program. And you said earlier around the definition of journalism and a willingness to question ourselves. At Europe, we've been open to this for years, making sure that we check that our intentions equal our impact and not assuming that a little bit of Europe gets you what you need. You need to complete the program to see a massive gain in your earnings over time, and we don't assume that just a little bit of Europe will get you along the way. And that's borne out in these heterogeneities repeatedly, that you need to make it through the program. Now, why do folks not make it through the program? Well, non-completion is most often the result of folks facing life challenges outside of Europe and not being able to balance that in harmony with completing the program. And so one other way to think through this debate is how do you reduce the likelihood of that friction happening outside the program, as well as what I mentioned earlier, the opportunity cost of participating in the program. One way to do that might be, and I'm going to circle back to skills now, is doing a better job of assessing skills and who's job ready sooner than others. Now, I think the skills measurements from some of the studies are not nearly robust enough, and the technical and workplace and career readiness skills marketplace is fragmented. I mean, there are thousands of proprietary tools trying to assess non-cognitive or professional skills, and they're doing it in mixed ways and not always normed on an opportunity talent population. If you get better at that measurement, using the right sets of tools that are designed for the demographic we're serving, you could be able to infer much more strongly who's coming through the Europe pipeline who might be ready for a job opportunity faster. And I think that starts to segment our population in a meaningful way. Some of those folks who fell out of the program and landed in that bottom quartile had too severe of an opportunity cost. But if we had a way to beeline them through training into the work-based learning opportunity with a much higher stipend of support that we have now, they might have seen success where they didn't in the original study design.
Yeah, the triaging question sort of permeates all of workforce development. You know, you need to have good systems for sorting people into the appropriate tracks of training and development, because you don't want to hold people back, nor do you want to push people out too soon when they aren't ready. Rick, I wanted to see if you had any additional thoughts on this topic of selection bias, in implicit selection bias in the sector-based training populations that you've studied.
Yeah, I see it more as an issue of generalizability, that this is a strategy that works for a narrow spectrum of the labor market. And I don't see it as a bias issue as much, because actually we'd expect the opposite. Like when we first saw the public-private venture study, we were really surprised that a program that had that much screening would have impacts, because that's also affecting the control group, like Kadeem was saying. Mm-hmm. So you'd expect if there's so much screening, the control group levels are going to be so high that they're difficult to exceed. Now, there could be some kind of interaction effect there, but the research design should be robust to handle that issue. That's why we're doing random assignment. So it's clear that these programs are achieving large impacts for this stratum of the labor market. I think the question, and Kadeem's work definitely speaks to this, is it is a relatively narrow stratum, and how do we widen that so that it's more generalizable to other parts of the labor market? I wouldn't want us to go back to the older training models, which hardly did any screening, because what basically happened is employers didn't employ the graduates of these programs. So you'd go through and spend 6 months in a training program only to not get a job, which is not good for anybody, of course. So I think it's a question of smart screening and trying to, like you said, triage so that we help the more disadvantaged workers complete the program and succeed. But right now it is, I think, valid for a segment of the labor market as a great solution.
So let's just continue on this thread just a little bit in terms of if you're trying to create the on-ramps for people. Not everybody's ready for Europe. What's the strategy for getting more people ready to be able to take advantage of this? Not you've only got a 10%, pipeline here of people applying and getting through. But what are your thoughts as an organization about how to make this kind of training eventually available to a larger population?
Well, we have a couple considerations. First is we're absolutely not for everybody. We are for many. That middle section, I so appreciate you describing the view of opportunity talent across the spectrum. That middle catchment or segment that Europe is serving, just in the cities where we currently operate, is about 3.4 million people. So there's plenty of folks to help, and an equal number of jobs, if not more, to find them homes in. So that's where I start, is understanding that catchment. But what comes before us is a really important question, and knowing that we're not necessarily for someone who doesn't have a high school diploma or a GED, or who has other really serious challenges. For example, we serve criminal justice system involved young adults. We only have so many internship and job opportunities that are record friendly, though. It would be irresponsible for us to serve en masse that demographic of student, knowing that we can't virtually guarantee their internship opportunity and placement afterwards. Some other programs don't do that. Some try and be everything for everyone. So we start by knowing we're not everything for everyone. And then secondly, we've got a couple of hypotheses for what we think will help move the field and gear folks more towards a Europe experience that they could be ready for. One of our seeding strategies is taking our professional skills and training curriculum and embedding it within high schools, a program called Career Labs, that it gives students, say 10th to 12th grade, a bit more look ahead and exposure to what life in the workforce might look like, what options they have available, and what skills emerging out of secondary school they'd need to apply, as one good example of that strategy.
So, very interesting. Remind me the number you said of the cities that you're in. How many are could potentially take advantage of Europe as it is right now?
We're in over 20 major metropolitan areas.
And how many people did you say?
3.4 million roughly in that catchment, that target population catchment. Yeah.
And this gets to kind of the question that we haven't talked about very much and we need to talk about, which is scaling of sector-based employment and training, which, that was the section of the report that I focused most of my attention on. It's hard to get from, say, tens of thousands of people to millions. That is a really big challenge in terms of reaching that many people and maintaining the quality of the program and not seeing it diluted. How much, and this is really for everybody here, but how much of the success of these programs is simply that they are relatively small and can put a lot of effort and resources into a fairly small number of people? So again, open to anybody has thoughts on that.
Yeah, I'd say we hypothesize that smallness is definitely a virtue, as we say in the paper. But there are ways of organizing so that institutions can tailor and customize and still be larger organizations. But that said, most of the organizations have been smaller, which implies that this localness, this knowing the participants, this knowing the labor markets, knowing the employers by name, is very important. That said, Europe has grown quite a bit. Perscolis has grown quite a bit. So providers have been able to implement this approach with fidelity in many cities. It's not getting up, like you said, Brent, to millions, but I think the one approach is to have more providers, whether it be through technical assistance from the Europes of the world and Perscolas, helping other organizations to learn this strategy, or growing those organizations. Or perhaps, like where your mind goes first probably, is also trying to do it through the community college system, which is sort of ready to go and already serving a fairly similar segment of the population. But the challenge there is, can we make community colleges sufficiently demand responsive, and can they really provide this sort of wraparound support? So I think if you went in that direction, you still have to involve the nonprofit providers to provide some of those services.
So it sounds like kind of an all of the above. We need to try a bunch of different things in terms of scaling. One of the things I talked about in the paper was that we do have a model of how to scale a successful practice, the nurse home visiting program, where Congress basically wrote into the authorizing legislation these very stringent requirements for what you have to do in order to be called an evidence-based nurse home visiting program. And I think that we'll see if over time whether the big expansion of nurse home visiting is successful. But to me, that's a good place to start. At least start with what the evidence of what can say, this is what we understand about the practices that work, and make sure Department of Labor or Economic Development Administration or whoever is implementing the program, make sure that when you put your grants out on the street to be competed, that you are putting a framework out there that requires organizations to do those practices which are associated with success, rather than and having written some of these grants and RFPs, rather than go do good things and tell us how you're going to do it. But no, this is actually what you need to be doing. And relying, as Rick already alluded to, relying on the expertise of Europe and Perscolas and these better established organizations as kind of the technical assistance pass through to try to maintain fidelity to program models. Yeah.
Well, one quick question, it's actually a question for Garrett related to this. So I'm curious, Europe is a program that's grown over time, which is kind of within program scaling, if you will. And I'm curious, what are your guys' assessments? What do you guys think the limiting factor is for producing more or larger sites of Europe? I would imagine this has to be a question that you guys deal with internally. Like, should we launch in this city or something like this? And I'm curious what would stop that from happening.
Well, thanks for framing the question that way. I don't think it's any one thing, but there are a couple of standouts. So I'll aim to be concise here. The first is job demand. So there have to be employers, usually companies that we're already connected to, but certainly there can be new employer relationships that we establish with sufficient enough demand in those entry-level mid-skill roles that it merits us being there and serving as a staffing solution for them, a talent placement solution. Now, granted, we've analyzed a heck out of labor market data in every market and then others that we're exploring outside our footprint. And everywhere you look, there are jobs. Everywhere. And so we winnow and winnow and winnow and try and get down to now which occupations and specific roles within those employers are going to be most receptive to Europe young adults. So not barred by a degree requirement. Lots of companies are scrubbing degree requirements off of job postings, but that alone is not enough to ensure folks are actually hired into those roles. That involves an evolution of hiring practices that looks to things outside of a degree proxy to determine if someone's ready for the role. So job demand is number one. If we don't have it, we can't operate there. And frankly, this is one of our challenges and why Europe doesn't operate in rural areas. if we had employer relationships with sufficient enough demand in more remote locations, it would usually be in industries that are outside of our current service area. So you could imagine manufacturing, for example, being further removed from a city center, where there'd be the opportunity for Europe to bridge a relationship, but we don't currently train in that and have it. So it poses the question, and how do you get access to those other employers if that's a limiting factor? Well, maybe working with other training programs that do produce folks who are ready for manufacturing roles while helping with Europe's connectivity to employers and managing that relationship. Again, one of those talent networks I mentioned earlier. The other limiting factor is student interest. We're pretty well known in cities where we operate, but when we launch in a new market, we are in a sea of training providers. Mm-hmm. And even if we lead with really strong results that say, hey, in the marketplace of what you might do after high school, young adults broadly, here's a really good option for you that pushes on the conventional college pathway and could give you an alternative route into a career. That works in a bunch of contexts, but we don't necessarily have name brand recognition in all of those environments, and it takes time to earn the trust of a student demographic, especially one that's coming out of community college or other college settings going, I'm now in debt and I didn't get anywhere closer to a degree, what do I do now? You have to rebuild that trust, and that takes some time. I'd say the third limiting factor is funding. We didn't say this earlier, but as a social enterprise, we have a double bottom line revenue model, and that's philanthropy, about half philanthropy and about half earned revenue from companies who are paying us as a trainer and giving them trained talent. We access virtually no federal funding, and our cousin and sibling programs that have shown efficacy out there in the world may draw down from more public funding than Europe does, but it's not by majority. I think there is something to be said for structuring a grant program a little differently, such that the money doesn't get cut up 1,000 different ways by the time you reach the local level and goes out to all of the myriad ways you might connect someone to an employer, and gets geared more towards the evidence-backed solutions, or insist that a requirement is you are partnered with a program with evidence-backed.
So I want to just do a quick follow-up, and then we're going to go to questions in the room and online. So we've talked about, these are costly programs. They produce really good return, but they cost a lot up front. And you've also talked about the importance of sort of the earn and learn aspect of the program. You're paying significant stipends because that's important to success. In terms of program expenditures, how does that break down in terms of we devote X percent of our budget to actually providing wages to program participants versus all the other activities that we do?
So the pass-through for the stipend amount for this upcoming service year is about a full quarter of our total operating revenue is going pass-through to students in the form of stipends. So like hypothetically in a $100 million budget, 25 million is going to stipends, 200 million, $50 million is directly into students' pockets during their participation in the program. So you're right, it's a very significant investment.
This is not actually, that's significant, but not overwhelming. Yeah. I mean, it's just a problem to be managed, and you get to help manage that. So, okay, let's go to questions. Do we have any questions here in the room that people wanted to get into? We've got a couple online, but I wanted to give you folks who came in on a cold Monday morning. Yes?
Sure. Hi, I'm Jill Burke from Mathematica. I wanted to talk more about scaling through community colleges. It feels like the natural growth areas you've mentioned, and sort of what supports would facilitate that scaling?
So,
what federal supports, sorry to clarify.
Well, I actually think some of my colleagues will be ever more helpful on the federal support side in terms of funding structure. On the programmatic angle, I can share that Europe has approached scaling with community colleges in two major ways. The first, through a college-based model where we share staffing and infrastructure with a college, where classes are taught, some of the technical classes are taught in-house in colleges, and the professional skills training is taught by Europe staff in concert with that. And then we still facilitate a work-based learning experience, internship, and then job placement. We scaled rapidly through that model from about 1,500 to 2,000 students a year to about 5,000 students a year. So it's a 20% year-over-year growth over about a 4 or 5 year period. And it was tough. It was really hard ensuring that, well, it depends on the college partner because there's so much variability, but some have a really tight control over their curriculum and they don't want to see variations, and others are much more open to adapting curricula in response to market demand or feedback from employers. So that's one challenge that we need to work out. The second strategy we've attempted, and I think there's a play here for federal funding, so I'll quiet down on this note, is to imagine Year Up as a facilitated career services for a host of community colleges that have emerging graduates coming out with AA degrees, but no clear path to employment afterwards, where we have a comparative advantage of connectivity to a couple hundred employers nationwide, and those students are coming out arguably on a good footing of sound training, technical and elsewise, to potentially be ready for those job opportunities. And if not, we can layer on some additional support before sending them to that internship opportunity if that's required. But that's our hypothesis on scale. We think that's playable, and there are college partners willing to work with us. But funding that, truly funding that nationally, if that's a promising practice we want to pursue, is another question. Rick or Kadeem, or Brent for that
Yeah,
matter?
no, please, any thoughts on that, Rick?
I would just underline the word flexibility, which isn't the hallmark of federal funding sometimes.
But Rick, I'm making the argument for less flexibility here, right? I want to tell them what to do. Is that
we
not
have
the
to
right
tell
way?
them what to do, but within that, you have to have room to maneuver,
Yeah.
right? So which is a nuance there, because sector programs almost always pivot. As you even in the work advance evaluation, most of our providers have changed sectors a little bit or moved a little bit in terms of the jobs they're focused on as the economy changes. So there has to be community colleges would have to be willing to customize the curriculum to a large extent, and some of them are quite good at doing that. Like there's just a lot of variation there, and I would also say partnership is critical because I think a lot of community colleges don't have the wraparound support to do this alone. So they would have to do it, I would say, in conjunction with organizations like Year Up.
So are there any sites in which Europe is sort of actively engaged with the community college system, maybe on campus already or on site at campuses, kind of making themselves available to students as they're thinking about transitions to work?
We have a couple of locations where we are piloting that model I described as the facilitated career services, which has been very promising. And so we're working to grow that model this year a bit more into a few other test sites. So we do have a few sites operating that way. And we have many more, especially over the last 10 years, in that co-located college-based model, where we have a presence, but really it looks like the bread and butter Year Up offering alongside of dual enrollment in college. So that plays a little differently. We can produce the outcomes we otherwise would through the program because those students are enrolled in Year Up and the college. It's not necessarily maximizing connectivity to work for those in the college who aren't connected to our program. Say they're emerging from the community college about to finish. If that career services isn't offered there, it's really the Year Up program over the course of up to a year alongside of college enrollment.
So one more question just related to research on this. Rick, you and I have talked about, and you referenced it in your presentation as well, that we have this cluster of program activities and services, and they're creating these outcomes. We don't really understand how each component impacts these outcomes. What's the right way? What should we be thinking about from a research standpoint? What's the right way to begin the process of going deeper into these component issues and trying to tease out the stuff that we don't yet understand, kind of the black box stuff that Kadeem was talking about?
Yeah, I would argue that we don't need too many more tests of whole bundled programs. At this point, we know the strategy can work, so we don't have to keep showing that. I think what we need to show is what are the active ingredients and components and the combinations of components, and I think Kadeem's work is a great step forward on that. And that, from a research perspective, that would point to what we call A/B testing. So testing a provider who's running this program with this feature turned on versus that feature, or just combinations or component testing. But I don't think we need to continually test this against no service control groups anymore. At this point, I think it's the time to really move into that A/B testing, an approach that's used very often in the industry to figure out the active ingredients.
One thing that I'd flag, I don't necessarily want to use this as just a plug for some ongoing work that I have, but there are other, I think, creative ways to try and distinguish between components. So one thing that I've been thinking about in the context of Europe is because there's a sizable amount of program dropout. If it's the case that you can find an instrument, something that varies the amount of the program that someone got before getting to the end, so before getting to the point where they reasonably could be placed, that could be a way of trying to understand, does additional exposure to everything else actually lead to effects? And maybe that would be a better way of getting at the sort of human capital component, where it's like, one person got 3 months, another person got 5 months of the program. You'd expect the person with 5 months, all else equal, to have better outcomes if it's the case that you get more human capital from just being in the program. And so I'm working on estimation strategies to make that a legitimate comparison.
So if we have any research funding organizations that are listening in on this conversation, Kadeem is interested in talking with you. Okay, any other questions here in the room? I think we have covered most of the questions that came in online. So I'm going to take this opportunity to give you 5 minutes or 4 minutes of your day back. Thank you so much to all the panelists for coming. This was a big effort to get here, and we greatly appreciate it. It's so encouraging to me to know that we actually do have something that works. We need to understand more about how it works, and we need to figure out how to make that available to more people. But at least we've got something, and that is a really significant improvement over the state of research that we had before sector-based employment came along. So I think we can all take that encouragement. I thank all of our participants and all those of you have been watching online. And stay tuned for more interesting research around workforce development here at AEI and the progress that's being made by great organizations like Europe around the country.
Thank you.
Thanks.